I returned home after 3 days attending my brother's funeral in Montana, amidst the biting cold of a Wyoming winter. The long road, snow-covered with wind whipping at my face, still couldn't clear my head. I just wanted to walk inside, to find Helen waiting for me as she always did. But the moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. The house was pitch black, not a single light, not a sound. The curtains were drawn tight, something Helen rarely did, especially on days she felt anxious and needed light to feel safe. I stood on the threshold for a few seconds, trying to catch any sound. Only the wind whistled through the eaves. I flicked on the hall light. The living room felt touched, but not in a familiar way. A chair was askew. The blanket, usually neatly folded on the sofa, was balled up in a corner. A cup in the kitchen still had condensation, as if someone had just used it. I softly called Helen's name. No answer. My heart began to pound faster. Helen never left without a note, especially on days her memory was erratic, and her phone was always on loud so I could call her when needed. I checked each room, one by one. The master bedroom was untouched, but Helen's pillow was ice cold. The study wasn't disturbed, but the filing cabinet was slightly ajar. The safe was wide open, papers scattered on the floor as if someone had frantically searched through them. I picked up each sheet, my heart sinking, as I realized some important documents were missing. Helen's medical records folder wasn't there. The stack of bills she kept neatly in the second drawer was gone. I was about to go to the kitchen to call the police when I heard a soft sound behind me. I turned and froze. Eliza Rowan stood in the middle of the kitchen, arms crossed, as if she had been standing there for a long time and this house belonged to her. Her gaze showed no surprise at seeing me. Instead, she looked at me with a strange pity, as if I were the one complicating everything. I asked where Helen was. She answered immediately, her voice so calm it sent chills down my spine. Helen was being cared for at a treatment center. Before we move on, I just want to say thank you. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this voice travels. I waited for more details, an address, a doctor, a plausible explanation. But no. Eliza just spoke briefly as if everything had been decided without my presence. When I asked when Helen left, she answered vaguely. When I asked how she was taken, she avoided my gaze. When I asked why she didn't call me, she merely shrugged. Each answer tightened a knot in my stomach. I didn't believe it. Not because I immediately thought Eliza was lying, but because too many things didn't add up. Helen couldn't have gone to any treatment center on her own without me, and Eliza had no right to make that decision unilaterally. I walked around the kitchen, opening every cabinet. Food had been moved. Some items had been opened recently, but every sign pointed to Helen not being the one who used them. I left the kitchen, heading towards the laundry room. The phone charging cabinet was still open, but the cord was empty. I called Helen's number. Still off. I tried 3 times. No change. Helen never left her phone off for more than an hour, unless she was sleeping, and she never slept at this hour. I stepped into the living room again, trying to piece everything together. The house showed no signs of external break-in, no forced doors, no items taken except for the documents. But the atmosphere, it was cold, a different kind of cold, a cold that suggested something serious had happened right within these walls. I turned back to look at Eliza. She stood too calmly, too still, too deliberate, not like a caring relative coming to help, more like someone guarding something or hiding something. I asked directly, "Where's Helen? Is she safe?" This time, Eliza looked at me longer, but that gaze didn't answer. It evaded. It closed off, like a door she didn't want to open. In that moment, the first thought that entered my mind, a thought that sent a chill colder than the snowy outdoors down my spine. Something had happened to Helen, something Eliza knew, and she wasn't going to tell me. I took a deep breath. All the peace I'd left behind 3 days ago was gone. The house still smelled of an unwashed dinner, but there was no one to cook it. The bedroom still held the soft towel Helen used every night, but she wasn't there. And standing in the middle of the kitchen was Eliza, who had no reason to be here. The more I looked, the more certain I became of one thing. Something terrible was happening, and Eliza was trying to hide it from me. I couldn't explain it in words, but I knew this feeling well. The feeling when the person you love most is in danger and you weren't there to protect them. A feeling that ran down my spine, forcing me to stand tall and not overlook any more details. I looked around one last time. Everything told the same story. Helen had not left here voluntarily, and I had to find out what had happened right now. I turned and walked into the hallway, determined to check everything again. No more panic, only one thing left: suspicion. And that was the starting point of a journey I never wanted to embark on. This is a story of deceit. When I saw Eliza standing there in the middle of my own kitchen, I knew something was amiss, but at that moment, I couldn't name it, couldn't form it into a complete thought, just a cold sensation tracing down my spine. But that very silence, that deadly silence, it was the starting point for everything I was about to discover. I remember standing still for a few seconds, just trying to breathe normally again, but my breath wasn't normal. The air in the kitchen wasn't either, a strange smell like reheated food that no one ever ate. As if someone had been living in my house, but it was certainly not Helen. She hated leaving food out overnight, hated that smell, yet it hung heavy in the kitchen like something forgotten during my days away. I remember asking Eliza where Helen was. She answered so quickly that I had to look at her face again to see if she was telling the truth or trying to push me away from the line of thought I was having. At a treatment center, she said, but no name, no address, no mention of who took Helen, no mention of when, and in her terse statement, there wasn't a hint of genuine concern. I left the kitchen before my head exploded from the discomfort. I had to check the house. I had to see if what I felt was real. I had to see with my eyes, touch with my hands, instead of listening to a baseless explanation from someone I had never fully trusted. The living room was where I went first. Every item in that room was connected to one of Helen's habits. Just a glance was enough for me to know something was wrong. And indeed it was. The sofa had been pushed slightly to the left. Not much, but enough for me to see it wasn't in its correct place. That sofa was heavy. Helen couldn't have moved it. I looked at the throw blanket, the one she always folded neatly. Now it lay askew, as if someone had used it as a cushion and then gotten up in a hurry. I walked around the living room and opened the drawer beneath the TV stand. Helen's pill organizer. It was gone. Not in the basket, not in the small medical kit we kept right next to it. I remembered counting her pills before leaving for Montana. Helen needed to take them daily, carefully, on time, correct dosage. Mild dementia was not to be trifled with. Missing medication for a few days, her memory could become severely jumbled. But the person caring for her these past few days let her medication disappear? If she was taken to a treatment center, how could her medication just vanish? I looked at her medication schedule. The last 3 days were blank. No marks, no updates. Coinciding exactly with the time I had been away from home. At that moment, I felt my stomach clench. Not from fear, but from a rage so intense, I wanted to smash something. I had left Helen in a fragile state, and someone had taken that lightly. I walked towards the back room, where the spare bed was. We used it for guests or when Helen had trouble sleeping, and I would sleep there to give her space. But that bed showed signs of being slept in, not once, not twice, for many consecutive nights. The sheet was stretched to the exact shape of a body. The corner of the blanket was wrinkled as if the sleeper had tossed and turned multiple times during the night. Not Helen. I was certain. Helen wouldn't have slept here while I was gone. I returned to the kitchen. Eliza was still standing there, squinting at me as if I were making too much of everything. When I asked her why the spare bed showed signs of being slept in, she merely offered a forced smile and said, "I stayed a few nights." A few nights in my house, without informing me, without asking permission, without any updates about Helen. I remember standing there for a few seconds, trying to keep my voice from snapping, but the image of the living room, the medication schedule, the spare bed, they coiled into an indigestible knot of anger. I needed proof. I needed the truth. I couldn't rely on Eliza's words. I took out my phone and started calling every treatment center in the area. I called so many. I knew every key press by heart. No center had a Helen registered. No place had admitted anyone in the past 3 days. No admission records. No one confirmed Helen being brought in. When I returned, Eliza stood there with a look of irritation, as if I were bothering her in my own home. She said I was overthinking. She said Helen wanted to go without telling me, fearing she would bother me. She said I should trust her. Every word she spoke sounded more absurd the more I heard it. I didn't reply. I walked into the study and opened my computer. I logged into our joint bank account. I will never forget that feeling. My chest felt squeezed. In 3 days, exactly 3 days, I was absent. 4 large withdrawals had been made. Our savings account was nearly emptied. A transfer into Eliza's account. Memo, personal debt payment. I had to read it twice. Personal debt payment. My and Helen's money, our life savings, money for Helen's medical care if she needed it. I scrolled deeper into the transaction history. All withdrawals were authorized by a POA, power of attorney, a document that requires the signatory to be fully lucid. Helen couldn't have signed in a state where she'd missed medication for 3 days. Helen couldn't have signed with her memory fluctuating and without me beside her. I didn't want to believe it. I truly didn't want to believe it, but every word, every number, every date proved otherwise. I sprang up, my heart pounding. I had to find out where Eliza got the POA. I searched the desk drawers, searched my bag, then I hurried towards the wastebasket next to the desk, and amidst the shredded paper, I found it. A crumpled, wrinkled copy of the POA, the ink still fresh. Helen's signature was skewed, shaky, as if she was told to sign while disoriented, and in the small print below, Eliza's signature was in the assistant signatory section. Assistant signatory, for someone with mild dementia, without professional supervision, without me, Helen's legal guardian, in the house. I felt my hands tremble, not from fear, but from a surge of indignation washing over me like hot water. I clutched the POA, the feeling of the crinkled paper in my hand, making me realize a stark truth. Someone had used my wife's illness to do what they wanted. I returned to the living room, looked at the entire house again, everything, every small detail, from the shifted chair to the stale smell in the kitchen, from the blank medication calendar to the slept-in spare bed, all felt like tiny needles piercing the same spot. Eliza wasn't caring for Helen the way she claimed. She wasn't here to support. She wasn't here to help. She was controlling my house. She was taking my assets. She was using Helen, the most vulnerable one, to sign the paper she wanted. And the worst part, Helen wasn't in the house. No one knew where she was. No treatment center had admitted her. I walked out to the garage. I didn't know what I was looking for. Just an urge to keep going, to dig deeper, until nothing was vague anymore. On the workbench, I saw a fuel receipt blown askew. It wasn't mine. I always kept my receipts in a small box in the car, but this receipt was new, and it was from the gas station near the northern forest, about a 40-minute drive from home, near the family cabin, a place few people went, a secluded place, a place where if someone wanted to hide someone, they would choose. I stood looking at that receipt. It felt like my heart skipped a beat. I pieced together each fragment: missing medication, blank calendar, spare bed slept in, house disarrayed, forged POA, account emptied, Helen missing, receipt near the cabin. Not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, not a caregiving oversight. It was a plan. A plan executed while I was away. When the house was missing, the only person who knew what Helen needed and what she couldn't decide on her own. I took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in my body. I knew I was entering a different stage. No more doubt, no more questioning, no more hesitation about whether I was overthinking. I knew clearly that Eliza was manipulating everything, and Helen was somewhere in a situation she couldn't escape on her own. I clutched the fuel receipt tightly in my hand. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the garage door crack like a reminder that I no longer had time to stand still. I had to find Helen. I had to know the truth. I had to go to the cabin. And that's when I realized this was no longer a journey for answers. This was a journey to save the wife I had left alone for too long. This is a story of betrayal. As it's I stood before Helen's desk, where she still sat every morning to jot down the small details her memory often forgot. The light from the window cast a cold gleam on the desktop, mirroring the feeling creeping up my spine. I opened the folder Eliza had left, and on the very first line, the date slammed into my eyes like a slap. The POA signing date, exactly the day I was in Montana, standing in the snow, watching my brother's coffin lowered into the ground. It couldn't be a coincidence. It couldn't. I flipped the paper back and forth, looking at Helen's signature, shaky, faded, skewed far down to the bottom edge. Helen didn't sign like that. Even if her memory was weak, her hand had never trembled to this extent. My intuition at that moment was like the sound of metal scraping against a door, cold, sharp, and foretelling ill. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up, illuminating the room, which was already dark because I'd forgotten to turn on the lights. I logged into our bank account. My heart felt like it plummeted to the wooden floor when I saw the vanishing numbers. Our joint account, 30 years of savings, empty. I scrolled down the transaction history. A dense series of withdrawals appeared. Each transaction was no more than a few hours apart. And all of them fell within the 3 days I was away from home. I clicked on each item, one by one. The withdrawal orders had authorized signatures. POA. This POA. Who authorized it? Eliza. Her name was right under the authentication section. I leaned back in my chair. My eyelids twitched constantly. I asked myself countless times, Helen? Did she really agree? But no. I knew Helen. She would never make a major decision without me by her side. She was afraid of misunderstanding legal documents. She always asked me about every little detail. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, then opened them, trying to steady my breath. I pulled my chair over to the bookshelf and took out Helen's small notebook, the notebook she used whenever her mind felt tired. I quickly flipped through the last few pages. Her handwriting was more distorted than before, twisted like strained ropes. Eliza said I needed to sign this paper, to pay bills. Said I'd forgotten about this. My head is tired. Can't remember clearly. I signed, must be right. I read it once, then again. Then I paused for a long time at the word tired. I heard Helen's labored breathing beside my ear. I heard her trying to grasp a thread of memory slipping from her hand. I clutched the notebook so tightly the cover almost tore. I sprang up and went straight to the garage. I didn't turn on the lights. The dim glow from the small lamp on the wall was enough for me to see the toolboxes, old crates, and the corner where Helen usually kept miscellaneous items. I bent down to pick up a receipt someone had tucked between the cracks of a box. A fuel receipt from the gas station near the northern forest. I knew that place. Helen and I used to stop at that station every time we passed by the family cabin. The receipt had a very clear date, 3 days ago. The same time as the withdrawals, the same time I was in Montana. I froze. I looked at the receipt as if it were an unspoken confession. The cabin deep in the woods, a place no one went unless they had a reason. I asked myself, slowly and heavily, if she wanted to hide Helen, where would she take her? The cabin was the most logical choice, secluded far, few passers-by, no one would notice. I returned to the house and began searching the cabinets in the living room. I wanted to find something more, however small, to piece everything together. Then I saw it. A small bag pushed into the innermost corner. I opened it. Helen's pills, the medication she needed to take daily. Being absent for so many days could severely disrupt her memory, making her more susceptible to manipulation. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. The medication schedule hung on the refrigerator. I rushed to it. I looked at the completely blank squares for the 3 days I was away. Helen never forgot to mark them. Never. Even if she forgot to take her medication, she still remembered to mark it, just so I wouldn't worry. I pulled out the nearby drawer looking for her pen box. The pen was still there, no signs of being used. As if someone deliberately left the calendar blank, as if to hide the fact that Helen hadn't been here. I returned to the living room. The sofa was pulled a few centimeters out of place. The rug was slightly shifted. Small changes, but obvious to someone who had lived in this house for 30 years, like me. I placed my hand on the armrest of the sofa, cold, not like Helen's warmth, but Eliza's perfume lingered, the kind she used every time she visited. I recalled her gaze this morning, not panicked, not worried, just frighteningly calm, almost deliberate, almost like someone standing in their own space. I left the living room and went into the guest bedroom. I turned on the light. The bed was sunken on one side as if someone had slept there for many consecutive nights. I bent down and touched the edge of the mattress. There were a few strands of hair mixed in, not Helen's hair, short and dark-dyed, exactly Eliza's hair color. I had tried to stay calm all that time, but by then I knew everything was heading in a direction no one wanted to believe, no one hoped was true. But the evidence didn't lie. It piled up before me, like layers of cold ice covering my heart. Accounts emptied. POA signed on the day I was away. Helen's notebook, blank medication schedule, cabin showing recent signs of use, fuel receipt, guest bed slept in. Each small detail, standing alone, might just be a coincidence. But when linked together, it formed a path leading in only one direction. Eliza. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching the receipt. My breath was heavy, as if a stone lay on my chest. I no longer had any doubt, no longer hoped that I had been overthinking. Everything was clear. Helen wasn't at any treatment center. She had been taken, separated from this home, and Eliza had done it calculatingly. And when I understood that, the first feeling wasn't anger, it was pain. A sharp, piercing pain, like needles from within. For Helen, for the panic she must have endured, for the image of the woman I loved having to sign papers she didn't understand. That pain pushed me forward, and in that moment I knew I had to go to the cabin, not just to find answers, but to find Helen, immediately. If you are ready, just say Part B, and I will continue with the next 100 words seamlessly. This is a story of family drama. I left the guest bedroom, my heart feeling as if it were beating out of sync. A choked feeling lodged beneath my sternum. There was no longer any room for even a sliver of hope. I walked into the study, turning on the only desk lamp still alight. The faint yellow glow illuminated a thin layer of dust I hadn't noticed this morning. Helen always cleaned this spot daily. Without her, the dust would accumulate very quickly, just like this. I pulled out the familiar chair and sat down, my hand still clutching the fuel receipt. I opened the computer again, re-examining the transactions more carefully, and just as I scrolled down to the second page, I saw a description I had overlooked in my panic. Money transferred to Eliza Rowan's personal account. Not a joint payment account, not an account used for medical care, directly into her personal account. I lifted my head. The room was utterly silent, as if holding its breath with me. I could hear every beat of my own heart echoing in my ears. This is no longer helping. This is usurpation. I said it aloud, as if I needed to hear the sound to believe what I was seeing was real. I continued to cross-reference the transaction dates and times. All were executed within 48 hours. Fast, decisive, as if someone was exploiting the moment I was away from home to get everything done at once before I could return. I leaned forward, staring intently at the screen as if trying to see through it. I tried to find some sign that Helen had done this herself. But no, nothing. Every trace led to one person. I stood up and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. That was where Helen kept important documents, things she worried I might misplace with bills. Inside was the crumpled POA document. I'd seen it before, but now I looked closer. As I spread it out on the table, I noticed some smudged ink, as if someone had signed while their hand was shaking. Helen did shake, but to this extent, that was when she was truly frightened. I whispered a question, almost unconsciously. Helen, how scared were you? That question kept replaying in my mind, like the echo of wind in the forest every winter. I turned the paper over. There was a faint crossed-out mark, as if someone had tried to correct information and then changed their mind. Someone knowledgeable in legal matters wouldn't do that, but someone manipulating a person with dementia might. I sighed, a long, breath-losing sigh. Then I returned to Helen's notebook. I opened to the last page with her writing. The page was slightly crumpled and had watermarks, as if her hand trembled excessively as she wrote. Eliza said I forget many things. Told me not to ask Arthur. She told me to just sign. I'm tired. I don't remember clearly. Those lines felt like they were piercing my chest. I closed the notebook as if closing an escalating piece of criminal evidence before my eyes. I stood up and went straight back to the garage again. This time, I turned on all the lights. White light shone down on the concrete floor. I opened the storage cabinet and checked every bin. I looked for any sign of Helen. One of her scarves? A pair of shoes left behind? But no, nothing related to her. But there was something else. A pair of black gloves discarded in the waste bin in the far corner. Not mine. Helen didn't use this type of glove, but Eliza did. I distinctly remembered her wearing similar gloves when she helped me clear out the storage room a few years ago. I picked them up with my fingertips to avoid touching the inside, full of dust and dirt, a little dry mud. The mud from the northern forest was exactly this kind of soil. I knew it. I had walked on it 100 times. I gently squeezed the gloves, supple, soft. Not an old pair. She had used them recently. I placed them on the workbench in the garage and looked at them for a long time. The gloves seemed to stare back at me, telling me that everything I thought was true. I returned to the house. I opened the refrigerator, not to find food, but to check inside out of habit. Helen always arranged everything in order: milk on top, eggs in the middle, vegetables in the bottom drawer. But now, everything was haphazard. There were 3 containers of pre-made food that weren't Helen's. She never bought this kind of ready-made meal, but Eliza loved them. I closed the refrigerator and leaned back against it. I exhaled, hearing the wind whistle through my teeth. Eliza has been living in this house for many days. I spoke slowly, each word like placing a stone on the ground. I walked over to the window, looking out at the yard. Snow had thinly covered the driveway, but there was a tire track, as if a car had left a few days ago. Helen didn't drive in winter. She couldn't remember the pedal order. The only person who would have driven a car in those 3 days was Eliza. Where had the car gone? The cabin? The gas station? Back to the house to redo papers? I didn't know, but every direction still led back to her. I went back inside and checked Helen's phone again. Still off, completely silent. Helen never turned off her phone. Even if she forgot to charge it, she'd still leave it on. I picked up the phone and held it in my palm, swiped up on the dark screen, cold, as if abandoned. I asked myself, if she's at the cabin, what does the phone being here mean? Helen couldn't call anyone, couldn't text for help, couldn't be located, as if someone deliberately ensured she was completely isolated. I stood up. Each step in the house suddenly felt heavy. Every door I opened, every corner I looked into, seemed to remind me that Helen hadn't left home the way Eliza claimed. She was taken, separated from everything familiar, placed somewhere I couldn't find her. I returned to the desk. The fuel receipt was still there. The crumpled POA papers lay beside it. Helen's notebook right next to them. The evidence aligned, like a string of arrows pointing north, and the cabin was to the north. I placed my hands on the desk and bowed my head, just for a moment. Then I stood up straight. In that instant, I felt something shift inside me. No longer doubt, no longer trying to find reasons to believe in the good, only the truth, raw, cold. I knew I had to go to the cabin immediately, not to check it out, not to be sure, but because I knew Helen was there, and she was waiting. Even if she didn't know she was waiting for me. This is a story of sweet revenge. I stepped onto the porch, bracing against the bitter wind whipping my face. Wyoming winters are always cold, but today felt different. It was a cold that seemed to warn me. Whatever I was about to find in that cabin, it wouldn't be pleasant. I locked the door, key tucked into my coat pocket. The car idled, warming up. Its engine hummed faintly beneath my feet, yet my heart felt anything but warm. It was a hollow void, deeply carved, filled with pain and a silent, swelling rage. I drove the familiar road north. Soft snow dusted the pine branches along the way. The sky, a stretched gray canvas. I remembered how Helen loved this view whenever we headed to the cabin. She used to say winter made people feel small, reminding them how much they needed each other. The thought made my chest ache. Where was she? Was she cold? Was she scared? Did she think I'd come for her? My grip on the steering wheel tightened, knuckles white. The drive from home to the cabin was usually just 30 minutes, but today it stretched like an hour. Tires crunched over the thin layer of snow, a dry, grating sound. Each crunch urged me faster. The wind shrieked outside the windows, drawing out each breath like someone calling out in vain. As I turned onto the narrow path leading into the woods, a strange feeling intensified. This place should have been deserted. No cars, no fresh tire tracks. But today, beneath the thin snow, were deep, fresh tire marks, untouched by further snowfall, as if someone had been here just hours ago, or even this morning. I turned off the music, slowed down. With every passing foot, I felt myself drawing closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to face. But I had no other choice. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, my heart hammered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The front door was closed, but something was wrong. There were footprints on the front steps, small shoe prints. Helen didn't wear that kind of winter boot, but Eliza did. I got out of the car, stepping onto the snow. A faint crunch echoed in the chilling silence. I approached the door. The outer padlock was gone. Someone had removed it. The lock dangled loosely, as if pried off in a hurry, no one bothering to reattach it. I gripped the doorknob. Ice cold. I took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. Inside, it was darker than I remembered. Our cabin always flooded with light when the windows were open, but today the curtains were drawn tight, as if someone was trying to hide the light. Or hide a person. I stepped in and flipped the switch. A weak yellow bulb cast a dim glow over a room heavy with a damp, stale odor. Not the smell of a cabin unused for a long time. This was the smell of anxiety, of human presence, of a place where someone had been kept for too many days. My head spun, searching for any sign. On the table, 2 water glasses, one half empty, the other almost full. Helen never drank half a glass and left it. If she left it, it meant she was rushed or terrified. I moved closer, placing my hand on the tabletop. Cold, no recent warmth, but in the nearby trash can, crumpled tissues. Helen always flattened her tissues before discarding them. These weren't hers. I walked directly to the small back room, where Helen liked to keep extra blankets and supplies for our cabin trips. I grasped the doorknob and pushed gently. The moment the door cracked open, a smell of disinfectant wafted out. Cheap, floor-cleaning disinfectant. Not what I usually used. Not what Helen would ever choose, but I had smelled this scent before. Yes, at Eliza's house. She used the exact same kind. I stepped inside. On the bed lay Helen's old blanket. I recognized it. I'd brought it from home to the cabin myself last year. The blanket was disheveled, as if someone had bolted upright in the middle of the night or tossed and turned restlessly. I placed my hand on the edge of the bed. A faint warmth. Not much, but enough to know someone had been here recently. I bent down and saw a small piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up. Helen's handwriting, the same frantic script I'd seen in her journal. I want to go home. I don't remember why I'm here. I'm scared. I stumbled back as if the floor had shifted beneath me. I reread the words several times, the pain so sharp I couldn't breathe deeply. Helen had written that in fear, in cold, in solitude. I stood straight, turning back to the main room. The yellow light flickered weakly, threatening to go out. I searched around the cabin, opening every cupboard, every corner, every small door. No Helen, no sound, no sign she was still here. Everywhere I looked, only remnants remained. The blanket, the note, the water glasses, as if she had just left, as if someone had taken her out just before I arrived. I walked out to the back porch of the cabin. The cold wind cut into my skin. The sky was heavy and gray. I looked down at the ground. There were drag marks on the snow, faint but clear enough to see someone had moved in a hurry, treading on soft snow. I followed the direction of the marks. They led towards a small road winding down the hill. That road only led to the old logging area, a deserted place rarely visited, a place where if someone wanted to hide something, no one would ever know. I swallowed hard, trying to quell the tremor in my hands. I went back into the cabin one more time, searching for any other evidence. And then I saw it. A small key resting on the wooden stairstep next to the entrance. A silver key, engraved with C17. Not for the cabin, not for my house. I picked it up, turning it gently. It was too clean to be an old key, like it was newly made, like it was for a temporary lock. And then a faint sound echoed from beneath the floor. Not the wind, not the wood contracting. It was the sound of metal clanking. I stood motionless for a few seconds. The cabin had a small cellar for old storage. It had been years since I'd gone down there. I walked to the floor hatch leading to the cellar. My hand trembled as I placed it on the handle. I pulled it up, and the hinges shrieked like someone being choked. I looked down, dark, but there was a thin streak of light left by some device. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shone it. In the cellar, the dirt floor was disturbed. There were hastily cut rope marks near the wall, and right next to it was Helen's old blanket. I almost collapsed. I had no more doubts. Eliza had kept Helen here, then moved her somewhere else, and all the evidence in the cellar were the traces she hadn't managed to erase. The depth of her deceit hit me hard. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my skin. I looked around that dark room, and for the first time in years, I heard my own anger resounding in my head, so clear it was like a scream in my ears. I had to find Helen, now. I closed the cellar door, rushed out of the cabin, and climbed into my car. I was no longer afraid, no longer hesitant, no longer holding on to any false belief in Eliza's explanations. I had enough evidence. I had seen enough truth. And I knew, when I followed that trail one step further, I would find Helen, and I would uncover the full extent of the crime Eliza had tried to conceal. Just one more step between me and the ultimate truth. I vividly remember the moment my car stopped in front of the cabin. The sky was leaden gray. The wind howled through the pines, making the entire forest moan. I stood outside for a few seconds, not because of the cold, but because of a heavy intuition swelling in my chest. The cabin door was padlocked, a new, shiny metal lock, utterly out of place on this old cabin. Footprints overlapped around the porch as if someone had just been there but left in a frantic hurry. I looked at those footprints and my heart constricted. Everything I'd uncovered these past few days, it was all leading me to this very place. I pounded on the door. No answer, no sound, only the wind whistling through the wooden cracks. And then I heard a gasp, very faint, like someone calling out, utterly devoid of strength. I practically tore the lock off. Rotten wood, rusty nails, everything gave way with just a few desperate tugs. I pushed the door open. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying a dry scent of dust, of stale food, of life abandoned. The space was pitch dark, only a narrow sliver of light from a half-covered window. Helen, I called her name, my voice trembling as if it wasn't my own. Something stirred in the corner of the room, a small, hunched figure, hands twisted together. I stepped in, my eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom, and I saw her, Helen. Her gaze was blank, as if she didn't recognize me or couldn't remember how to. Her hair was matted, lips cracked and dry, clothes rumpled as if worn for days. She tried to stand when she saw me, but her legs shook violently, as if a strong gust of wind would send her collapsing. I rushed to her, catching her. Her skin was ice cold, but her hand, it still sought mine, like the deepest reflex of a fading memory. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so scared." I embraced her, a mix of anger and agony surging through me. I didn't know what to say. No words could adequately describe what I was seeing. My wife, starved, imprisoned, driven into a state of panic so severe that her already fragile memory was utterly shattered. I pulled her outside, wrapping my coat around her, and guided her into the car. I held her close the entire way to the hospital. I only remembered one thing, her hand, trembling incessantly, yet gripping my coat so tightly. The doctors admitted her immediately when I carried her in. I heard them utter words like dehydration, acute stress, exhaustion. Lucky we arrived in time. I stood by her hospital bed, watching them administer IV fluids, attach monitors, check her reflexes, and I felt as if I were in some strange alien room, unable to believe what was happening, unable to believe someone I had once invited into my home could do something like this. When Helen finally fell asleep, I walked out into the corridor. I didn't cry. I couldn't cry. I just stood there, clutching the railing until my knuckles turned white. The only feeling then was fire, a cold fire, the fire of betrayal. I called the police right then. When they arrived, I handed over everything I had found in the past few days: the anomalous POA copy, bank transactions, Helen's journal, fuel receipts, photos of the cabin, the new padlock. Nothing was omitted. Each piece of evidence was a stab wound to my heart, but I gave them everything, because at that point I knew there was no turning back. The police worked swiftly. They questioned me, verified the clues, inspected the cabin, collected fingerprints. Everything was done by the book, legally, without a single hurried step. When they asked me one final question, "Are you sure you want to proceed with this?" I looked through the glass window at Helen, lying in her hospital bed, and I simply said, "I am sure." That evening, Eliza was arrested. I was at the station when they brought her into the interrogation room. She no longer had the confident air she had worn in my kitchen. Gone was that sickeningly sweet voice saying, "Helen is being well cared for." Eliza avoided my gaze. She knew. She understood that everything was over. I listened to the interrogation, my heart empty. Eliza equivocated, omitted details, spoke in circles, but the financial and legal evidence was too clear. The days Helen disappeared aligned with the dates of the transactions. The cabin was exactly the distance from home recorded on the gas receipts. And most importantly, Helen's signature on the POA matched the day I was in Montana. The police only needed to piece it together. That was all. And when they were done, they forwarded the case to court. The trial didn't take long. I will never forget the image of Eliza walking into the room, her hands cuffed. She looked straight ahead, but her eyes were empty, like someone who had lost all means of justification. Her lawyer tried to argue care, good intentions. Helen agreed, but all attempts shattered against the undeniable evidence. The prosecutor presented bank records, cabin photos, signature analysis results, medical reports on Helen's debilitated state. Each piece of evidence echoed in the courtroom like a hammer striking metal. I watched each document projected onto the screen, saw the numbers she'd withdrawn from our joint account, and I felt like I was watching a film of my own life, turned upside down by someone else. When they asked for my opinion, I simply stated, "I just want my wife to be safe." Helen couldn't testify due to her health, but the doctor submitted official records, clearly stating that her stress and dehydration were directly linked to her restricted freedom. Those cold, dry lines of text, they made me feel the pain more acutely than any words could. The judge deliberated carefully. At one point, I thought they might prolong the case, but then, finally, the time for sentencing arrived. The judge's voice resonated, slow but heavy. Defendant Eliza Rowan is found guilty of abusing a vulnerable person, defrauding property, and unlawful detention. The sentence: 12 years in prison and compensation as stipulated by law. I stood still. A part of me felt lighter, as if a storm had passed, but another part felt colder than a Wyoming winter. There was no joy, no sense of victory, only one truth. Justice had been served, but its price was something I would carry for the rest of my life. I left the courthouse before Eliza was taken away. She didn't look at me, or perhaps she didn't dare. I didn't want to see her again either. As I drove back to the hospital, snow began to fall. Flakes hit the windshield, melting into long streaks of water. I sat in the car for a long time, resting my head on the steering wheel. I thought about the cabin, thought about Helen trembling in my arms, thought about the notes she'd tried to write in her confusion. Each detail came back, like shards of broken glass cutting into my mind. And I understood why this part of the story couldn't hold an ounce of warmth. Because truth is never warm. It's cold. It's dry. It's brutal in its very essence. But it was necessary. When I stepped into her hospital room, Helen was waking up. She looked at me, her eyes still hazy, but with something brighter than when she was in the cabin. I sat beside her, taking her hand. It still trembled, but this time, it squeezed mine tighter. I whispered, "It's okay. It's all over." She blinked, and a single tear rolled down her temple. I wiped it away, and in that moment, I realized that justice never truly brings happiness. It only brings the one thing a person can hope for when wronged: a clear ending, a definitive line between right and wrong. And the cost was the emptiness that Helen and I would have to fill together, moving forward. As night fell, I sat by her bed, listening to the steady drip of the IV. Each tiny beat reminded me that she was still here, and I was still here. The two of us, despite the loss, despite the betrayal, despite the scars that would never fully heal, were still alive. And that was the only thing that kept me standing as I moved toward the final part of this story. I stayed at the hospital with Helen for many days after the trial. She recovered slowly, so slowly, as if every cell in her body was trying to find its way back after a major storm. Sometimes she was lucid, remembering my name, remembering the blue wool blanket she loved most. But then there were times she would look at me for a long while and ask a question I'll never forget. "Arthur, where are we?" I smiled, though my heart ached with every beat. "Somewhere safe," I'd say. And I'd hold her hand, letting it know that no matter where her memory drifted, she was never alone. The doctors said Helen hadn't suffered permanent physical damage, but the psychological shock had weakened her memory further. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw it clearly in every moment. The way she paused mid-sentence. The way she struggled to find a simple word she'd always known. The way she tired when trying to piece together fragmented memories. But no matter what, she was still alive, and she could still get back on her feet. That was enough for me to thank heaven every morning. As for our assets, most were lost. The money Eliza had drained was used to pay off her own debts, and the law was clear. Money spent on a third party couldn't be fully recovered. A small portion was luckily frozen by the bank in time, thanks to police intervention, but the majority would never return. I sold our spare car, cut back on some expenses, and relied on my remaining personal savings to cover hospital bills and living costs. Step by step, I watched everything I'd built over years erode, all because of the greed of someone I once thought I could trust. But strangely, I felt no regret. I stood by the hospital window one evening, looking at the snow-covered parking lot. I thought about the months before, when I'd believed my life was peaceful, Helen was peaceful, everything would drift along a quiet, straight path. But it turned out, family isn't always safe just because you think it will be. This entire family drama had scarred us deeply. Betrayal from a stranger. It hurts. But betrayal from someone who once walked into your home, that can shatter your entire world. I wondered if I could have prevented this, but then I understood. Sometimes, evil doesn't arrive with a loud knock or a fierce glare. It comes with a smile, with words as light as silk, by making you believe it's helping you. I looked at Helen sleeping in her bed, her breath steady and weak. I realized the final lesson life wanted to teach me. Family is not a given. It needs to be protected. And if you have to stand up to protect it, sometimes the price is loneliness. And I had paid that price, fully, without missing a single dime. A week after Helen was discharged from the hospital, I brought her home. Snow still blanketed the driveway. I helped her out of the car, wrapping her coat tightly around her. We walked slowly, one step at a time, because she wasn't as quick as she used to be. Every step of hers reminded me that everything had changed forever. But then, when I opened the door, she turned to me, smiling very faintly. A tired smile, yet beautiful in a way that was hard to describe. The smile of someone who had walked through darkness and knew who was the only one still waiting at the end of the road. That evening, we sat together on the old wooden bench by the window where Helen used to love to read. I draped a blanket over her shoulders. Outside, the wind howled as if calling through the woods, but inside, our small house felt strangely warm. She leaned her head on my shoulder, asking softly, "Is everything over now, Arthur?" I looked out at the dark sky. Streetlights cast a faint, misty yellow glow on the snow. I said, "Yes, it's over." But deep down, I knew nothing was truly over. The loss remained. The cracks in our hearts remained. The why questions still followed me every night. But justice had arrived, and that was the only thing that helped me get up and keep going. Betraying family always carries a heavy price. That price isn't a sentence or a prison cell. The real price is what cannot be regained: trust, peace of mind, mornings without worry, evenings without watching someone you love struggle to remember a small thing. Justice is necessary, even if sometimes it forces people to accept loneliness, to accept a reality that is no longer whole, but at least it puts an end in the right place. I looked at Helen. She held my hand, her fingers trembling, but gripping very surely. Wyoming winter was still as cold as ever, but in this house, between two people tested to their limits by life, there was still one thing no one could take away. We still had each other. If there's anything I want you to take away from this story, it's two simple things. Family must be protected, and betrayal always leaves scars longer than any court sentence. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I wish you and your family good health, peace, and enough clarity to always recognize who truly stands by your side. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. Thank you very much for accompanying me.